In the mythology of the American Air War, there is one plane that gets all the glory, the B-17 Flying Fortress. It was beautiful. It was stable. It was legendary for its ability to return home with half a tail and one engine. But there was another bomber in the sky. One that the crews didn't love, but the generals couldn't live without. The consolidated B-24 Liberator. If the B-17 was a graceful dancer, the B-24 was a dump truck. It was boxy. It sat low to the ground on tricycle landing gear. It had a fat, slab-sided fuselage. When German fighter pilots first encountered the B-24, they were unimpressed. They called it the furniture van, mobile wagon. They mocked its appearance. It looked ungainly. More importantly, they quickly discovered that it wasn't as tough as the Flying Fortress. If you shot a B-17 full of holes, it kept flying. If you hit the wing of a B-24 in the wrong spot, the wing would snap off, and the plane would drop like a stone. The Luftwaffe pilots viewed the B-24 as the easy kill in the American formation. They would weave through the bomber streams, actively looking for the boxy silhouettes of the Liberators, ignoring the B-17s. Go for the Liberators, the squadron commanders would radio. They burn faster. This reputation for fragility was partly earned. The B-24 had a complex hydraulic system that ran through the entire plane. One stray bullet could sever a line, filling the fuselage with flammable mist. But the German pilots, focused on the tactical flaws, missed the strategic reality. They didn't understand why the Americans were building this ugly plane in such massive numbers. They didn't realize that the B-24 had two superpowers that the B-17 lacked: speed and range. The B-24 was faster, and it could carry a heavier bomb load further than any other heavy bomber in the European theater. While the Germans were laughing at the flying brick, the B-24 was quietly extending the reach of the Allied air forces. It was closing the map. The Germans thought they were safe deep in the Balkans or far out in the Atlantic. They believed they were out of range. But the ugly stepsister was about to teach them that there is no such thing as too far. The secret to the B-24's performance and its fragility lay in its wings. The B-17 had a thick, broad wing. It generated massive lift and could take a beating, but it created a lot of drag. It was slow. The designers of the B-24, at Consolidated Aircraft, decided to use a revolutionary new design, the Davis wing. Named after its inventor, David Davis, it was a high aspect ratio wing. It was long, thin, and tapered. It looked like the wing of a glider. When wind tunnel tested, the Davis wing produced numbers that were so good the engineers thought their equipment was broken. It generated tremendous lift with very little drag. This meant the B-24 could fly faster than the B-17. It meant it burned less fuel to carry the same weight. This efficiency was the key to its range. However, the Davis wing had a dark side. Because it was so thin, it couldn't have the massive internal spars that made the B-17 wing so tough. It relied on a stressed skin construction. This made it vulnerable to combat damage. If a German 20mm cannon shell exploded inside the wing structure, it could compromise the integrity of the whole spar. German pilots learned this quickly. Aim for the wing roots, they told each other. They watched as B-24 wings folded up in mid-air, sending the fuselage spinning down in a death spiral. They thought this design flaw proved American incompetence. Why build a plane with a glass wing, they scoffed. They didn't understand the trade-off. The Americans accepted the fragility because they needed the legs. They needed a plane that could cross the Atlantic without stopping. They needed a plane that could fly from North Africa to the oil fields of Romania. They needed a strategic weapon, not just a tactical survivor. The German engineers, obsessed with durability and over-engineering, couldn't grasp the concept of a disposable high-performance machine. They laughed at the Davis wing as a fragile toy. But that wing was carrying the war to places the Luftwaffe couldn't defend. The first place the German mockery died was in the cold, grey waters of the North Atlantic. For the first years of the war, the U-boats had a sanctuary. It was called the Black Pit or the Tear Gap. This was a massive stretch of ocean in the mid-Atlantic that was beyond the range of aircraft flying from Britain, Canada, or Iceland. In the Black Pit, the U-boats were safe. They could surface in broad daylight. They could recharge their batteries, run their diesel engines, and hunt Allied convoys like wolves in a sheep pen. The German captains felt invincible there. They knew the limit of the enemy's reach. Then came the B-24 Liberator. The very long-range variant of the B-24 was stripped of armor. Extra fuel tanks were installed in the bomb bay. It turned the heavy bomber into a marathon runner. Suddenly, the air gap began to shrink. Imagine the shock of a U-boat lookout. He is scanning the sky, 800 miles from the nearest land. He expects emptiness. Instead, he sees a 4-engine bomber dropping out of the clouds. Alarm! Flieger! Alarm! Plane! The U-boat crash dives. But the B-24 is fast. It drops depth charges before the submarine can fully submerge. The hull cracks. The U-boat sinks. The German High Command was baffled. Where are these planes coming from? Admiral Donitz demanded. They cannot fly this far. They assumed the Americans must have developed secret aircraft carriers or mid-ocean refueling bases. They couldn't believe a land-based bomber could patrol the middle of the ocean. The B-24 closed the Black Pit. It forced the U-boats to stay submerged during the day, crawling at slow speeds, draining their batteries. It blinded them. It hunted them. The psychological impact on the U-boat crews was immense. There was no safe place anymore. The sky, which had been their friend in the gap, was now an enemy eye that never blinked. The B-24 didn't just sink submarines, it broke the blockade of Britain. It allowed the convoys to get through. The flying brick had become the guardian angel of the Atlantic supply line. The ultimate proof of the B-24's range and the folly of German underestimation came on August 1, 1943. Operation Tidal Wave. The target, Ploiești, Romania. This complex of oil refineries supplied 60% of Germany's crude oil. It was the fuel pump of the Nazi war machine. It was located deep in Eastern Europe, far beyond the range of any B-17 launched from England or Africa. The Germans considered it untouchable. They had built defenses, flak guns, smoke generators, fighter bases, but they didn't really expect a mass heavy bomber raid. The distance was simply too great. The Americans gathered 177 B-24 Liberators in Libya. The plan was audacious. They wouldn't bomb from high altitude. They would fly on the deck. They would fly 1,200 miles, drop down to 50 feet off the ground, and fly straight into the refineries. It was a suicide mission. When the B-24s arrived over Ploesti, they flew so low they were clipping the cornstalks. The German and Romanian gunners were stunned. They depressed their anti-aircraft guns to fire horizontally. They were shooting at heavy bombers that were flying like fighters. The B-24s flew through walls of fire. They flew through the intense heat of burning oil tanks. German flak trains ran parallel to the bombers, engaging them in point-blank duels. The losses were horrific. 53 aircraft were lost. 660 airmen died or were captured. But the damage was done. Refineries were ablaze. The flow of oil to the panzer divisions was interrupted. The German High Command was shaken to its core. They realized that their strategic depth was a myth. If the Americans could strike Ploesti from Africa, they could strike anything, anywhere. The B-24 had proven that distance was no longer a defense. The German pilots who intercepted the surviving bombers on their way home saw something new. They saw B-24s riddled with holes, engines smoking, wings shredded, yet still flying. They saw gunners fighting back with ferocious intensity. They realized that the furniture van was not a soft target. It was a dangerous, long-range predator that would fly into the mouth of hell to destroy its target. Ploesti was a tactical bloodbath, but a strategic revelation. The B-24 had arrived, and it had brought the war to the doorstep of the Reich's most vital resources. The Germans called the B-24 a furniture van from the outside. The American crews who flew it had their own name for it. The flying boxcar. If the outside was ugly, the inside was a nightmare of industrial claustrophobia. Stepping inside a B-24 wasn't like entering a vehicle. It was like climbing inside a piece of heavy machinery while it was running. The fuselage was slab-sided and wide, which gave it more internal volume than the B-17. This was great for carrying bombs, but terrible for the crew. It was a maze of hydraulic lines, electrical cables, oxygen hoses, and control wires. The main way to get from the front of the plane to the back was a 9-inch wide catwalk running through the bomb bay. Below the catwalk were the bomb racks, holding tons of high explosives. Below that, the bomb bay doors, which were flexible, roller-shutter doors that retracted up the sides of the fuselage, unlike the swinging doors of the B-17. Walking that catwalk at 25,000 feet, while wearing a heavy sheepskin flight suit, oxygen mask, and parachute, was a terrifying balancing act. One slip meant falling into the bomb bay. If the doors were open, it meant a 25,000-foot drop. The hydraulic system was the lifeblood of the plane, powering the turrets, the landing gear, and the bomb doors. The lines leaked constantly. The floor was often slick with red hydraulic fluid. The smell inside a B-24 was a unique mix of high-octane fuel, hydraulic fluid, ozone from the electrical equipment, unwashed bodies, and fear. It was loud. The 4R-1830 engines were mounted close to the fuselage. The roar was deafening, a constant, bone-shaking vibration that lasted for 8 or 10 hours. It was cold. At altitude, the temperature dropped to -40 degrees. The gunners stood at open windows, their heated suits the only thing keeping them from freezing to death. To the German pilots attacking it, the B-24 was just a target. They didn't see the 10 men inside, struggling against the elements and the machine itself just to do their jobs. The B-24 was a brutal workplace. It demanded constant vigilance, physical endurance, and a kind of grim stoicism from its crews. They knew they were flying in a plane that was faster and longer range than the B-17, but they also knew it was less forgiving. It was a tool of total war, designed for efficiency, not comfort or survival. The German fighter pilots quickly identified the B-24's Achilles heel: the nose. The B-17 had a chin turret with twin .50 caliber machine guns, giving it formidable firepower against head-on attacks. The early models of the B-24, D model and earlier, had a glasshouse nose. It was a massive, multi-paneled greenhouse where the bombardier and navigator sat. It offered incredible visibility, but it carried only small, handheld .30 caliber machine guns that popped out through sockets in the glass. These guns had a limited field of fire and lacked the hitting power to stop a charging FW-190. German tactics evolved to exploit this. They developed the 12 o'clock high attack. A squadron of German fighters would form up miles ahead of the bomber stream, far above them. They would then dive head-on, closing at combined speeds of over 500 miles per hour. For the bombardier and navigator sitting in the glass nose of the B-24, it was a terrifying experience. They would see the German fighters growing from specks to monsters in seconds. They would see the winking flashes of the 20mm cannons. The glass offered absolutely no protection. A single cannon shell hitting that nose would shatter the entire structure, killing the crew instantly and exposing the cockpit behind it to the 200 miles per hour sub-zero slipstream. It was a slaughter. The Luftwaffe pilots, who had mocked the B-24's appearance, now treated it as a preferred target. American bomber commands were losing nose crews at an alarming rate. This vulnerability forced a redesign. Later models, like the B-24H and J, were fitted with a powered Emerson nose turret with twin .50 calibers. This gave the B-24 teeth. But for thousands of airmen in the early years of the war, the glass nose was a death sentence. It was a chilling reminder that even a revolutionary design like the Davis wing couldn't protect them from a determined enemy with a tactical advantage. The German pilots saw the B-24s over their cities. They saw them falling out of the sky. They thought they were winning the war of attrition. What they couldn't see was what was happening 4,000 miles away, in Ypsilanti, Michigan. Willow Run. This was the ultimate secret weapon of the B-24 story. It was a factory built by Ford Motor Company, under the direction of Charles Sorensen, Ford's production genius. It was the largest factory under one roof in the world. It was 1 mile long and 1/4 of a mile wide. Before the war, aircraft were built like artisanal products. They were hand-assembled. It took months to build a heavy bomber. Ford applied the principles of automotive mass production to the airplane. They broke the B-24 down into thousands of sub-assemblies. They built massive jigs and fixtures that ensured every part fit perfectly without hand-filing. They created a moving assembly line for a 30-ton bomber. At one end of the factory, raw aluminum ingots entered. At the other end, fully fueled B-24s rolled out the door and took off. The scale was mind-boggling. At its peak, Willow Run was producing one B-24 every 63 minutes. That is one heavy bomber an hour. 24 hours a day. The German intelligence services knew about American production, but they couldn't grasp the reality of it. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, struggled to build a few hundred tanks a month. The idea that the enemy was building heavy bombers faster than they could build Volkswagen Beetles was incomprehensible. It rendered the Luftwaffe's victories irrelevant. A German ace could shoot down 5 B-24s in a week, and he would be hailed as a hero. But in that same week, Willow Run had built 150 new ones to take their place. The B-24 was the most produced American military aircraft of the war, with over 18,400 built. Willow Run built nearly half of them. It was a river of aluminum that drowned the Third Reich. The Germans were fighting a war of tactics. The Americans were fighting a war of industrial mathematics. And the math was merciless. The range of the B-24 allowed the Allies to try strategic concepts that the Germans couldn't even imagine. One of the most ambitious was Operation Frantic, the Poltava shuttle. The idea was simple, but revolutionary. American bombers based in England and Italy would bomb targets deep in eastern Germany or the Balkans. Instead of turning around and flying all the way back, they would keep going east. They would land at Soviet airbases in Ukraine, specifically at Poltava. There, they would refuel and rearm. Then, they would take off and bomb another target on their way back to England or Italy. This shuttle bombing had profound strategic implications. First, it allowed the bombers to hit targets that were previously out of range. Second, and more importantly, it completely disrupted the German air defense system. The Luftwaffe fighter network was designed to intercept bombers coming from the west and returning to the west. Their radar, their fighter control centers, their flak batteries were all oriented one way. Suddenly, American bombers were appearing from the east. German pilots would scramble to intercept a formation only to find the bombers were flying away from them, deeper into Soviet territory. It caused chaos. German controllers didn't know where the threats were coming from. The B-24 was the workhorse of these missions. Its range made the shuttle possible. The sight of American heavy bombers landing on Soviet soil was a powerful propaganda victory. It showed the unity of the Allies. It also led to disaster when the Luftwaffe followed the bombers to Poltava one night and destroyed dozens of them on the ground, but the strategic point had been made. The Poltava shuttle proved that the B-24 had turned the entire continent of Europe into a single battlefield. There were no borders. There were no safe zones. The Germans were being attacked from the north, south, west, and now, the east, by the same aircraft. The B-24 had erased the geography of the war. While the B-17 Flying Fortress is the icon of the European theater, the Pacific theater belonged to the B-24. The geography of the Pacific War was defined by one thing: water. Endless, blue water. The distances between island bases were immense. The B-17, with its shorter range, simply couldn't cover the ground, or rather, the ocean. The B-24, with its Davis wing and massive fuel capacity, was the only heavy bomber capable of reaching the Japanese Empire until the B-29 Superfortress arrived late in the war. From dusty coral airstrips in Guadalcanal, New Guinea, and the Philippines, the B-24s took off on marathon missions. They flew 1,500-mile round trips to strike Japanese shipping and bases at Truk and Rabaul. The crews called themselves the 7-mile snipers, a reference to the long bomb run required for accuracy, though often exaggerated. The conditions were brutal. In Europe, if you bailed out, you landed in a French farm field or a German city. You might be captured, but you were alive. In the Pacific, if you bailed out, you landed in the middle of the largest ocean on Earth. You faced sharks, dehydration, and vast emptiness. The B-24's long legs were the only insurance policy the crews had. They modified the planes for even more range. They stripped out weight. They added extra fuel tanks in the bomb bays. The Japanese pilots, flying lightweight Zeros, were often shocked to encounter American heavy bombers so far from any known base. They would attack, but the B-24s, flying in tight formations, put up a wall of .50 caliber fire. The B-24 also excelled in low-level anti-shipping strikes. Using snooper tactics at night, radar-equipped B-24s hunted Japanese convoys. They dropped bombs from mast height, skipping them into the sides of transport ships. The B-24 strangled the Japanese supply lines just as effectively as the submarines did. The German pilots in Europe had mocked the B-24 for being ugly. The Japanese pilots learned to fear it because it was omnipresent. It was the workhorse that carried the war across the date line, proving that in the Pacific, range wasn't just an advantage, it was a prerequisite for survival. The B-24's large fuselage and long range made it the perfect platform for a secret war that was just beginning, electronic warfare. The Allies needed to map the German radar network. They needed to know where the Wurzburg and Freya radars were located so the bomber streams could avoid them. They created the B-24 Ferret. These were standard Liberators that had been stripped of bombs and packed with sensitive radio receivers, oscilloscopes, and direction-finding antennas. They bristled with strange protrusions. The crews were specialized Ravens, electronic warfare officers. They flew alone, often at night, skirting the edges of German-controlled territory. Their job was to get painted by German radar. When a German radar operator turned on his set to track the lone bomber, the Ravens would intercept the signal. They would analyze the frequency, the pulse width, and the location. They were mapping the invisible eyes of the Luftwaffe. The Germans had no idea they were being spy mapped. They thought they were just tracking a lost bomber. Based on the data collected by the B-24 Ferrets, the Allies developed jamming devices, carpet, and countermeasures, window or chaff. They routed the massive D-Day air armadas through the gaps in the German radar coverage discovered by the Ferrets. The B-24 also served as a jammer itself. Later in the war, Joustus B-24s flew inside the bomber formations, blasting out radio noise to blind the German night fighter controllers. It was a high-tech game of cat and mouse. That flying boxcar had become a flying computer lab. It showed that the B-24 was versatile enough to be more than just a bomb truck. It was an intelligence asset that blinded the enemy and saved thousands of lives by winning the war of the electrons. For all its range, speed, and versatility, the B-24 had a dark secret that terrified its crews. It was a death trap in a crash. The B-17 was famous for its durability. If a B-17 ditched in the water, Its low wing and broad fuselage often allowed it to float for a long time. Crews could get out. The B-24 was different. The Davis wing was mounted high on the fuselage, a shoulder wing. The fuselage itself was deep and slab-sided. But the bottom of the fuselage was weak. The bomb bay doors were flimsy roller shutters, not structural steel. When a B-24 hit the water, the impact was catastrophic. The high wing meant the fuselage hit first. The weak belly would collapse. The water would rush in with the force of a tidal wave. The fuselage would almost always snap in two, right behind the flight deck. The nose section would dive underwater instantly. The heavy wing, laden with engines and fuel, would crash down on top of the fuselage, crushing anyone trying to escape from the waist gunner positions. Ditching a B-24 was often a fatal event. Pilots knew this. If they were damaged over the Channel or the Pacific, they would often choose to bail out over water rather than try to land the plane on the waves. That flying brick didn't float. This fragility was the price paid for the Davis wing's performance. The engineers had optimized the plane for air, not for water or impact. It was a calculated trade-off. The extra speed and range saved lives by avoiding flak and fighters. But if luck ran out, the design offered no mercy. German pilots who saw B-24s go down noted how quickly they vanished. One moment a plane, the next a debris field. It was a grim reminder that even the most advanced weapon of the war was a compromise between lethality and survivability. When the war ended in 1945, the United States had a surplus of airplanes. The B-17s were flown home. They were celebrated. They became movie stars, Memphis Belle. They were preserved in museums. The B-24s were melted. Because of their complexity and their specialized design, the Air Force didn't want to keep them. They were harder to maintain than the B-17. So, they were scrapped with ruthless efficiency. Thousands of B-24s were flown to boneyards in Arizona. Giant guillotines chopped them into pieces. They were smelted into aluminum ingots to build houses and toasters for the post-war boom. Today, there are fewer than 15 complete B-24s left in the world. Compared to the dozens of flying B-17s, the Liberator is a ghost. This erasure from history is ironic because the B-24 was the most produced American military aircraft of all time. Over 18,400 were built. It dropped more tons of bombs than the B-17. It flew more missions. It served in every theater, from the ice of Alaska to the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of Burma. It was the backbone of the strategic bombing campaign. It was the plane that closed the Atlantic Gap. It was the plane that destroyed the German oil industry. The German pilots had underestimated it because it was ugly. The American public forgot it because it wasn't glamorous. But the B-24 Liberator was the true workhorse of victory. It proved that winning a global war requires a machine that can go the distance, carry the load, and be built by the thousands. The ugly stepsister never got to go to the ball. She just stayed home and won the war. And as the aluminum ingots cooled in 1946, the physical form of the Liberator vanished, leaving behind only the free world it had helped to save.